hugs. It is I, the adorable Eva Webb. This is Titular Characters, and in this 68th installment, we're featuring David Avellone. David is a filmmaker who expanded into writing comic books in 2014. Since then, he's written a number of titles, including Betty Page, Twilight Zone: The Shadow, Zorro, Swords of Hell, Elvira, Mistress of the Dark, and he co-created the Drawing Blood series with comics legend Kevin Eastman. He hosts the podcast Pulp Today and co-hosts the Writer's Block with Rayland Grant. And he's here today to talk with us about comics and his creative process. Hey, David. Welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me back.
I understand you've got a really exciting project right now. What's going on with it?
I think you're talking about Elvira Meets Vincent Price, which will be out on August 4th. You know, my joke when people ask me, what's it about? I'm like, it's Elvira Meets Vincent Price. If that title does not interest you, nothing I tell you beyond that premise will interest you. Like, either you love those people or you don't. And if you don't love those people, you're a bad person, and what's wrong with you? But it was pitched to me over a year ago, and then, you know, I wrote two issues, and then the pandemic came and shut us down for almost a year. And then I wrote the final two issues. Well, now it's been bumped up from 4 to 5 issues, which is what Dynamite. It's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. But Dynamite frequently does this to me. They book me for a 4-issue series, and then if the first issue has crazy pre-sales and does well, and the Elvira stuff tends to, they go, can it be 5? And then when I'm halfway through writing 5, they go, did we say 5? We mean 8. And then 8? Oh, no, 12 would be good. So that's happened to me with Betty Page a little bit. That's happened to me with Elvira once or twice.
You know, that last Betty Page series that you were on, that went to all kinds of weird places that nobody expected it to.
I had the first 4 issues plotted out when I started. And that was one that I really expected to not be open-ended because it was such a beginning, middle, and end story. And when they told me we want a 5th issue of that, I'm like, but she defeated Cthulhu in issue 4, man. I don't know what I do after the Tinkerbell versus Cthulhu issue. But I actually came up with an epilogue for that made me so happy, which was, you know, after you've popped in and out of 4 parallel universes, you know, and your return to New York City in 1953, how do you process that trauma and how do you understand what happens to you? And I sort of looked at the history and what was around and what was happening. I was like, oh, you drive down the recently constructed New Jersey Turnpike to Albert Einstein in Princeton, and you ask him what the hell happened. And I love that issue for that reason. writing Albert Einstein was as much fun as writing Queen Elizabeth II in a previous series. And then when they said do 5 more after that, I just went with a classic 1950s sci-fi premise. I'm big on sort of jokey, punny titles, and the title of the second half of Betty Page Unbound was Invasion of the Betty Snatchers. And it was, nice. You know, it was that kind of alien invasion body double kind of story, which was, again, great fun. But the first half was called Crisis on Infinite Bettys. Sort of that was the joke title of it. And then for the second issue cover of that, Scott Chandler, without telling me or warning me or anything, did a beautiful satire of George Perez's cover for Crisis on Infinite Earths from the 80s, his number one cover, which was all the superheroes in outer space and planets exploding, whatever. And he did all of that, except every superhero was Betty Page. And I actually, I don't have a big budget for buying original comic book art, so I mostly only buy stuff from my own comics. But I wrote to Scott Chandler, and I was like, I kind of got to have that. I got to have that for my wall. I got to have Crisis on Infinite Bettys for my wall, because that's too beautiful.
That is
but yeah,
beautiful.
So back to Elvira and Vincent Price. By sheer coincidence, when I was trying to come up with a plot for that, a comics professional named Val Dorazio, I think I'm pronouncing that right, posted something about this crazy true story about a Vincent Price movie that was never made, but because a bunch of people making film guides in the early 70s were lazy, like they actually reviewed this movie that didn't exist. And it was called the Ares Computer. It was supposed to be part of the first movie in a 12-movie series where they were all going to be horror movies based on the signs of the Zodiac. And it got announced in the papers, and the movie never got made. And some lazy douche putting together Film Guide 1971 just went, I don't need to see this Vincent Price movie, right? You know, I'll just write a review that's like adequate price horror movie, 3 stars. And that's what he put in his Film Guide. And that got reprinted, and that information got repeated. If you go on the IMDb, there is an IMDb page for the Ares Computer. And the first thing in the trivia is this movie doesn't actually exist. Which, well, then why not take the page down, guys? Movies that got announced in the trades and never made, I don't know that they deserve pages. But going off that, I started thinking about the idea of, what if that film really did get made, and why did it get suppressed, and why did no one ever see it, and why was it never claimed by anyone? So that led to a whole ridiculous plot about the end of the world and Egyptian gods and stuff like that there.
Awesome. That's all the good stuff that you want to read. It's fun.
And, as I say, I always have the ridiculous title for a series. That one was almost called Raiders of the Lost Schlock. That is the title of issue 3. Because I have no self-control. Nice. But once they get to Egypt, it's Raiders of Lost Schlock. And it references that at the time I started writing, it had been announced that both Shudder and Netflix had turned Elvira down for a streaming series. So literally the first scene in the comic is Elvira and the fictional version of me trying to pitch an Elvira series at a streamer called Deathflix, and they don't buy it from us, and we're both very depressed. But anyway, it's a fun series. I think people will get a kick out of it.
The one question that I asked last time that I'd like to ask again is, how about your origin story? Where do you start with the world of comics?
Where I start with the world of comics, honestly, it's a little tricky because the person who introduced me to the world of comics now kind of hates me and wants nothing to do with me. So I don't mention them by name. But I had a friend at the time who was connected heavily in the comic book industry. And we were working together on a project not related to comics. And she asked to read some of my writing. I was actually working for her as a camera person and as an editor. And I had this film script from 2008, which I'm still very fond of, but it's one of those movies that was going to be made with all that money in the stock market that evaporated in October of 2008. So the project died a dog's death, but it's a very good script, if I do say so myself. And she read it and she said, wow, you can really write. Have you ever thought about comic books? And I said, yeah, it's actually come up a time or two, but it's just one more industry I don't have a foothold in. So pursuing that, why spend time and energy pursuing that when I'm already failing pursuing other things? And she said, well, let me recommend you to some editors that I know. And she recommended me to some editors. And one of them was Joseph Frybant, senior editor-in-chief. I don't know. He has the same job, but the title keeps changing. The senior editor at Dynamite Comics. And we met over drinks at San Diego in, I'm going to say, 2014. And he really liked, we really had hit it off. And he said, I'll give you a shot on something. Let me go back to New York and think about it. And he reached out to me a few weeks later about Bill Willingham had created a pocket universe at Dynamite called Legendary, spelled Derry, like it was a place, Legendary, like Londonderry. And it basically took all of their licensed characters and put them in the same steampunk universe. And the premise was that it was an alien planet and Flash Gordon crash landed on it. And they basically made up a steampunk culture imitating Flash Gordon. Like everyone's wearing goggles because Flash Gordon wears goggles. But it used like the $6 Million Man. One of the best steampunk jokes ever is Steve Austin is the $6,000 man because it's steampunk. You know, it's the same values as the turn of the century. But it had the Green Hornet and Red Sonja. I think the Phantom was in it, and Vampirella was in it. And at first they thought maybe the Green Hornet, and then I think they gave that. I can't remember who did it. It might have been Mark and Draco. But they gave me Vampirella, and they said, read the series, come up, tell us what you do with Vampirella in that universe, and we'll see where we go from there. And the last hurdle was they said, you have to call up Bill Willingham, who created all this, tell him your take, and if he likes what your take is, we'll approve you to go ahead and start writing the series. And I talked to Bill on the phone. And in the interim, I had written a pitch, and they had approved it, you know, based on if Bill liked it. But in the interim, they had actually taken away half, if not almost all, of the licensed characters from me. Like I had a bunch of licensed characters in there, and they're like, yeah, we're trying to cut costs, so maybe you can't use Flash Gordon and Ming the Merciless, and maybe you can't. So I ended up with mostly public domain characters or characters owned by Dynamite. So I did the Alan Moore thing, and I went, okay, I want to add more characters. And Bill's universe had honestly been very, very, very blazingly white. So I was like, let me see what I can do to make this a more diverse and more interesting universe. And I grabbed characters out of the Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad had just gone public domain. I'm like, all right, Kurtz is my villain. Excellent. And I threw in the Emperor Jones from Eugene O'Neill's play. And I used Rudolph Rassendyll and Rupert of Hentzau from The Prisoner of Zenda. And I told Bill I was going to do all this. And he's like, that sounds great. So I got the okay on that. And then, you know, I wrote those issues, and they, you know, I think Joe likes my writing, so he keeps hiring me. And that's basically, that's the origin story, that's, you know, been 80% of my work in comics. And other companies have approached me, and I've done some stuff here and there. And then at Emerald City in 2015, I met Kevin Eastman, and over the next year, we kept running into each other in San Diego and at cons, and we became pretty good friends. And then he asked me to collaborate with him on this thing he'd been working on for years called Drawing Blood, and then I co-created that with him.
So, what have the collaborations been like, and how do you spot a good one?
I mean, I'd say, you know, I will name no names in the 10%, but 90% of my collaborations in comics have been wonderful. And they're all a little different. You know, some artists want a little more freedom on the page to design it their way and do the panel designs they want. And some artists are like, no, tell me exactly what you want in every panel. As an example, Julius Oda, who I did Betty Page with, shares my love of research and period. And I would send him, I do this thing where every project I start a Pinterest page and I put up any costume, any prop that's important to me. And it's particularly useful, you know, if I'm doing something set in 1953, I really don't want my artist having to, in every single page, go, well, this character picked up a telephone. What is a 1953 telephone? Well, this guy got into a car. What does a car look like? You know, what are all of the... So I supply as much of that to save their time as I possibly can. And Julius is one of the few artists who got back to me as like, I think Betty should wear this dress that I found in a Vogue magazine from 1952. And I think this, and I love that. That's really great. And Dave Acosta, who I've probably collaborated with more than anyone on a whole bunch of comics. Dave is a true collaborator, particularly as the more things we've done together. Dave, I think, has felt more free to suggest jokes and plots and images. And, I don't always take what he throws out there, but particularly on the last Kickstarter we did together, which was Elvira, the Omega Ma'am, that had a very soft schedule. So we had like 6 months to work on a 40-page comic. And he contributed a lot to that comic. He contributed jokes, visual ideas, whole characters. And it was also something, because of how we were doing it, I was writing it and he was drawing it generally only a couple of pages behind me, which is not an ideal way to work in some ways. But in this particular case, I had the thing tightly outlined, so there were no big surprises coming up. But I was able to do things of like, he would draw a cool looking background character. And I was like, I'm giving that character a name and she's now going to have dialogue, because that's a fascinating thing you created there. So we do, as things go on, I think there'll be even more of that in our collaborations. And Kevin and I, we created Drawing Blood together, and a great deal of it is based on his life and based on his biography. But that said, the minute I become involved with it, just by there's no way you can write something and not be writing autobiography on some level. In some way, you can only reflect your own life and your own experiences. So, like, I've never had a partner like Peter Laird, and I've never met Peter, and I've never created $1 billion global franchise with an old friend of mine and then had it slowly drive a wedge between our friends. I don't know what any of that's like. I do have a sister that I was close to for a really long time who now hates me. So I always like to say in interviews, because people always ask me how much of the character of Peter Bookman is based on, or Paul Bookman is based on Peter Laird. I say, it's not at all based on Peter Laird. It's based on my sister. Like that's the relationship. That's the pain and the frustration I'm writing about. And that's where that comes from. So Kevin and I, luckily, and we learned this by becoming friends, there are a lot of ways in which we see the world the same way. Not so much that our writing our work together is, in some kind of bubble. He's had incredibly different life experiences than I've had. But there are some commonalities that are really interesting, and our attitudes towards things. We're both pretty positive people, and we've both been through a lot. We're like non-cynical people who've been through the ringer. And that's a real bond with us. So that collaboration, Kevin is one of the world's great enthusiasts. And if he doesn't like what you've done, he is beyond gentle about it. And if he loves what you've done, he's your biggest fan in the world. Like I've had conversations with him about stuff that we weren't happy about and stuff that we were working on. And he's been pretty brutal in those conversations. But then I'll hear him talk to the person whose work he's trying to correct. And he's like, oh, man, you're so great. You're the best. There's just this one small thing that we'd love to fix if you think he can do it. Like he never wants to make anyone feel bad. And that is I wish I was as good a person as Kevin. I wish I was as kind and as thoughtful as he is, but he's an inspiration to me.
When you write, how important is the plan? Everybody plans when they write, at least to some extent. Where do you fall in that spectrum?
I do a little of both. I can do a very tight outline, when I really have a strong sense of it. Sometimes there's just like a black hole in the middle of a story, and you go, I got 5 pages to open this thing, I got 5 pages to end it, and then I got 10 pages of the hero staring off into space, not doing anything because I don't know what to do in there. And, you can't, the thing I love about comic books is there is no waiting for inspiration to strike. You have to solve it. Dave Acosta is sitting somewhere with a mortgage to pay and kids and a wife. And if I don't give him the pages before he finished the last couple of pages, he doesn't get paid. And I will not have that on my conscience. So I've always got to, I pride myself on, I've never kept an artist waiting for pages. And what that means is you got to come up with a solution. Is every solution perfect and elegant? Absolutely not. And sometimes, things take a left turn while you're working on them and you go, oh, no. Now I got to step back and redo all this stuff. But in general, I have a pretty good faith in my own instincts. A lot of times, the trickiest thing about writing comics series for me is that I'm not allowed to write. Actually, I shouldn't say that. Elvira Meets Vincent Price is the first time I wrote 4 issues before anyone started drawing anything. And I kind of built that in. I was like, it would be great if I get just to write this, without the pressure of not being able to go back and fix the first issue after I write the 4th issue and go, let me thread this idea in from the beginning. So I've described previously that writing series, a lot of times in issue 1, I'm throwing lettuce, carrots, radishes, and cucumber in the air and then running around with a bowl going, hope this is salad when it lands in the bowl because I threw all the parts up there and, oh, shit, croutons. I guess we're going to have croutons in the second issue. So that's, to me, the biggest challenge is a lot of it is the tightrope of I don't get to know what's in the 4th issue when I'm writing the first issue 90% of the time. No matter how much I've planned, it's sort of good news, bad news. Joe Rybant doesn't like to waste my time. So he doesn't tell me about jobs until they're a lock. That often means I then have 2 weeks to write the first issue and plan the entire series before it has to all be in motion, before the cover is going to previews and the solicit is going to previews. And I have written solicits for comics I have not even begun to write. And you can kind of tell. I always used to joke about, you'd know when the TV Guide guy didn't get the information in time when it would say Star Trek, Channel 11, 6 o'clock, Kirk and Spock run into trouble on an alien planet. You're like, oh, that episode of Star Trek. So sometimes you do solicits that are like, Elvira confronts her greatest enemy. See what happens. Because I don't know what happens. I got nothing.
Oh, sure.
I got nothing for you. I don't know what's going to happen until I get there. So there's more of a degree of improv than I would like. Honestly, I would like to have 4 months to write 4 issues of comic, and then someone can start drawing it while I then write the next arc. And again, that's how it kind of worked out on Elvira Meets Vincent Price, partly by plan and partly by COVID. I don't know that I'll ever get a chance to do it that way again. But all the long way around of saying, yes, I do plan, I make outlines, I have notebooks where I generally do it by page. I say, page 1, this needs to happen. Page 2, this happens. Page 3, this happens. And then sometimes it's like page 4 to 7, a bunch of stuff happens that ends up here. And then page 22, the Death Star explodes. Great. Awesome.
Awesome.
I just have to get somehow from the kid standing on the ridge on Tatooine to the Death Star exploding in 10 pages, but I'm going to do it. So, I know every writer works differently, and I bet more of us than would admit it work differently on any given project, depending on the project.
Was moving from film, which is a very sort of dialogue-heavy medium, into comics, which generally isn't, was that challenging?
No, not challenging in the best way. I decided to take it as seriously as I've taken anything else. And, I took Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics down from the shelf and read it again. And I went, oh, yeah. And, I went back and looked at some of my favorite comics to go like, how was this effect achieved? What is the, because I had never really looked at comics in the analytical way that I've looked at film. In terms of writing it, yeah, it takes a minute to grasp the pacing. But it came faster, honestly, not to brag and not to be falsely modest, but I think the first 2 issues of Vampirella that I wrote, of Legendary Vampirella, I actually sketched them out completely because I wanted to make sure what I was asking the artist to do on the page made any kind of sense and would work and would even be possible. So, like, I drew my gross stick figure versions of everything. And what was really encouraging is when I got the first issue pencils back, my horrible sketches looked like the artist's 5-year-old child had tried to copy what they had done. So, like, okay, good. My script communicated what I wanted. And I didn't show those sketches to the artist at all. I was like, oh, no, I'm not going to embarrass myself like this. But then the pages came back and I was like, yeah, that's kind of how I thought that would look. So I did it one more time and then I never felt the need for that crutch ever again. Now I have the confidence, like, no, I know what makes up a page. And yeah, I say this to people a lot. It is exhilarating. I was 49, I think, when I started writing comics. I'm 56 in a couple of weeks. Man, take up a whole new art form medium in your middle age, because it's absolutely like being a kid again, because it was a real like, oh, hey, wow, this is a whole new thing for me to learn and to be excited about and to be thrilled by. And yeah, I couldn't recommend that more highly.
Is the process of creating comics maybe different than you thought it might be when you started?
Not, the thing that surprised me the most about it was I hadn't thought about all of the steps. And honestly, the steps make it more like film than I expected it to be. And by the steps, I mean, as the writer and in, at least in the collaborations I've mostly had, you're a little bit the director as well as the writer, because you suggested the camera angles in the same way that you tell a director of photography what you think it should look like. You tell them what the emotions on the faces of the character should be, which is like directing actors. And then you get back stuff that's not exactly that. And sometimes that's good and sometimes it's less good. And you then have to guide things in the way. But the process of seeing the pencils and seeing the inks and seeing the colors and seeing the letters, I was mostly a film editor for years and years and years. And boy, did it remind me a lot of film post-production. Reading the lettering proof is like sitting in the sound mix and going, oh, there needs to be a door slam there. And that dialogue needs to look like it's coming through a radio. That's like the sound mix. And the coloring is, part of post-production is color correction. And so you sit in the bay and go, no, make that a little redder. No, make that a little bluer. And so all that was actually more familiar rather than less familiar.
Is it hard to get in the headspace to write new characters? Where do they find their voices?
That's an interesting question. In the case of someone like Elvira, well, I've known that voice since the early 80s. And I love that voice, and I think she's hilarious. And I will say I was surprised at how easily the voice of, a showgirl with a dirty mouth came to me. It might have something to do with spending a decade hanging around my wife's burlesque shows. But it's, every characters are based on people on voices you've heard. As an example, my old mentor who passed away a few years ago, Adolphus Makis, was Lithuanian and spoke with a fantastically interesting accent. And even his sentence structure was Yoda-like in its unfamiliarity to spoken English. Like, you could understand what he was saying,
nice.
but it was so idiosyncratic. And that voice has shown up in a number of characters. But there's actually a character in the Kevin Eastman project, Drawing Blood, who's a Lithuanian gangster named Adolphus, who talks exactly like my old mentor. And that's generally it. Like, I don't know that any character is a pure act of creation. They're like someone you know. They're like some character. I would always say it's better if they're like someone you know than if they're like a character in a movie, because that's not someone you know. That's something someone else created based on someone they know. I do sometimes cast. I almost always cast comic books in my head, and sometimes even show the artist. A lot of times it's not. As an example, in the Doc Savage comic I wrote, I gave, to make the comic feel like it was from the 1930s, I suggested a bunch of 1930s actors as faces for the characters. And it wasn't draw Gary Cooper as Doc Savage. And if you read that comic, it would never occur to you that that was Gary Cooper. Looks a little bit like him, but it's more like this is the type. Ham is William Powell. The villain John Sunlight is kind of unmistakably Boris Karloff. But the way Sunlight is described in the pulp novels as like this big bony guy who looks like he could break your neck with his hands, I'm like, well, that sounds like Boris Karloff to me. And so when you're writing John Sunlight, you don't think of Frankenstein grunting, but some elements of Karloff's speech patterns probably snuck into that character, because I haven't known a lot of Russian emigre supermen cult leaders in my life. I've known a few, but I haven't known a lot.
Of course. Well, there's always a couple,
in
every
course,
friend group.
in every crowd. So, and Pat Savage was sort of a cross between Ava Gardner and Lauren Bacall a little bit, and some 1930s wisecracking stuff comes in there that wouldn't have been out of place in Lauren Bacall's mouth and all that. So, that stuff informs what you're doing. But I don't think I've ever really struggled with how does this person speak. I'll say this. My father always said that, and who was a novelist and wrote over 200 published novels, that what writers have to do is a lot of listening so that they can know what a truck driver talks like, and what a cop talks like, and what a lawyer talks like, and what a real estate agent talks like. And yes, is that a little harder when it's a Russian cult leader, supervillain, emigre from a gulag? It's a little tricky, but I've seen Vladimir Putin on television. You've seen how bad people talk. So yeah, I don't know that I've ever struggled. Usually, once I have the character template down, sometimes there's a day or two of going, what's Long Tom like? And then you go, well, he's kind of like Jimmy Stewart. Okay, great, Jimmy Stewart. And then, again, you graph that with people you've known who've had similar jobs, etc. And you end up with a characterization. I mean, I'm not one of those people. I don't know that I've ever needed to sit down and write full biographies for everyone. You know what I mean? And a lot of, sometimes it's because I'm working with licensed characters and I know what their biographies are. I know what they went through to get where they're going and all that kind of thing. But, sometimes it's good to know that stuff. I know there are writers who literally will sit down and write 10 pages of she went to Vassar and her boyfriend was like this. And then in her first job was this and that and the other thing. For me, a lot of times that comes out as you write. Someone asks the character, where did you go to college? And you go, Oh, she went to Vassar. Of course she did. That's who this person is. I generally find it's all kind of, once you have like an idea of who the person is in your head that's clear to you, all that stuff kind of just falls into place.
So how do you approach representation and inclusion? I know we touched on this
Sure.
earlier, but I think your insights here would be interesting.
I always say that the lack of representation, the lack of diversity in things, as much as it's racism and as much as it's sexism, I can say from personal experience, it is also laziness. Not to let anyone off the hook, but I don't think George Lucas thinks there's only one woman in the entire universe. But when he sits down to write Star Wars and he's writing a rebel base full of people, he's like, well, what are the leaders of the rebellion? A bunch of old white guys. What are all the people? What are all the pilots? All the pirates. Well, the pilots are like fighter pilots are now. It's a bunch of 30-year-old white guys. That's just a limited view of what the world is really like. And some people live in Modesto, California, and live in bubbles, and don't have a very diverse experience of the world. But that's not the real world. And I think the challenge, no matter what your perspective is, the challenge is to remind yourself that when character number 25 walks into the room, he doesn't have to be a guy about your height and weight and age, because that's what you understand. So you might as well just write another one of those dudes. The best stuff, I think, is from how the world really is and how inclusive the world actually is. As people always talk about forced diversity, and I always say, no, the forced diversity is when you make a movie that's only white guys. That's the forced part, because that is in no way representative of the world. I always joke about this. I went back and reread Isaac Asimov's Foundation, which is written in like 46 or 47. The irony is it's a book about a guy who's so smart, he creates a branch of science that can accurately predict the history of the future. There are no female characters in the book until page 136. And the cast of the book is college professors, scientists, politicians, senators, generals, astronauts, all walks of life. But until there's a scene where someone needs to model a piece of jewelry, I am so not making this up. And then it's a slave girl modeling a piece of jewelry. And then 10 pages later...
Because of course it is.
And then 10 pages later, the space tyrant is worked over a little bit by his Lady Macbeth wife. So those are the two female characters in a book that is supposed to accurately predict what the future is going to be like. And I have said this in rooms of nerds, and I've had some nerds, male nerds, say, well, it was 1946. And I always say, Wilma Deering is in Buck Rogers in 1920. Deja Thoris is in 1914. You're wrong. There are women in science fiction stories 30 years before Ike populates the future with not one lady. So that's a shitty excuse. And I will say that in the next couple of books, if I remember, I haven't read the rest of the series recently, but I believe the main character in the rest of the trilogy is a woman. And I will give Asimov some sort of credit for either being slapped in the face or going, holy shit, I wrote an entire book about the future of humanity with no women in it. All that to say, sometimes you just have to slap yourself upside the head as a writer and go, no, who would this character be in the real world? One of my other favorite answers to this question, a friend of mine named Bo Smith, who created Winona Earp, diversity and inclusion is just better writing. He was asked once, when you created Winona Earp, the 10th generation descendant of Wyatt Earp, did you make her a woman as some kind of feminist statement? And he said, I made her a woman because everyone else's choice would be to make her a man. And the good writing, the choice that is the left turn is to make her a woman. And I think Bo really hits the nail on the head there. And I'm all for making feminist statements. I'm all for, inclusion, diversity, and, pushing the envelope on all that stuff. But by the same token, Bo is exactly right. To make the 10th generation descendant of Wyatt Earp, Timothy Oliphant instead of Melanie Scrofano is the obvious choice. Some dude with a mustache and a cowboy hat and a six gun, just like Wyatt Earp. The smart writer goes, well, that's what everyone else will do. What can I do to make that different? And I really think that is literally the job of any writer on any story is, what is the audience expecting? What is everyone else going to do? What is the audience seeing in every other version of the story? How can I then make a left turn from that?
Just one observation after just going through a number of David Avellone books. They have this character to them. They're a lot of fun. Is there a secret formula to making them as distinct and memorable as they are?
I think there are a couple of things. One is I think characters that aren't smart are boring to write, and I'm not interested in writing them. If you go back and watch 1930s movies, the smallest character in a Frank Capra movie, a Preston Sturges movie, the doorman will have one line that he says to Gary Cooper or Frederick March, and it's a knockout. It's hilarious. That's what I'm trying to do. No interaction is so small that it can't be interesting, that it can't be funny, that you can't give the person, because, I think the mistake that a lot of people make, we could call it the Christopher Nolan mistake, is that life is funny. The worst things that can happen to you are also funny. The world is funny and ironic and interesting. And I'd rather people my stories with characters who are smart and funny than not. I actually don't want to spend a lot of time with characters who don't interest me as people. So I don't tend to write dummies. I don't, even the henchman will have a funny line, if at all possible. You try to give every character their due as a human being, because that's the way the world is. The grocery checkout bagger will sometimes say something funny and will make a good observation. And you know what? If they don't, that's not a very interesting scene, because I've been to the grocery store and I don't care. You know what I'm saying? To me, to the degree that my comics have any kind of heightened realism to them, it's that I try to make everyone interesting and have at least some kind of depth, or some, even if a character is dumb, is not very bright. I have a scene in Elvira Meets Vincent Price #2 where a not very bright muscle-bound henchman is suspended in midair. He's just jumped through a window without realizing he was doing it. And he's about to fall 3 stories and possibly break his neck. And in the Wile E. Coyote moment that he's hanging in the air before he falls, he says, "I've wasted my life." That's just funny to me. It's a little bit of a lift from a very unloved movie called Death to Smoochie, where an assassin who maybe has 3 lines of dialogue is falling to his death. And there's a shot of him falling towards the camera to his death. And he says, "I never saw Venice."
I remember that.
And again,
I loved Death.
That's just one of those things where a million writers and directors would not have put a funny line there. But, when you're writing something, I'm a big believer in, no matter how deep or artsy, I'm not one of those people that thinks art has to be serious. I'm a big fan of Fellini. And I once went to see 8½, with a crowded audience. And I will say that they were mostly hipsters. And they they didn't laugh in the first 5 minutes, which are funny. But they were so like, I'm in a serious art film that I've never seen before. He doesn't want me to laugh at any of this. No, I swear to you, he wants you to laugh at the guy staring back at Mastriani from inside his car in the traffic jam with a expression like that's funny. So again, it's impossible to dissect one's own style from the outside, but from the inside, I feel a responsibility to entertain you in every panel. Something interesting, something funny, an observation about humanity, an action scene presented in a way that you've never thought of or seen of before. And look, we've all written, A punches B, B kicks C in the chat. We've all written fight scenes that were, a little bit by the numbers. It's hard. There are scenes that it is very hard to go, how do I do this in a way that it's never been done before? But if you can, to me, that's the golden ticket. There's a much maligned James Bond movie that I love called Diamonds Are Forever. And if you listen to the director's commentary track, he's very, very funny. And he has the same take on particularly action scenes. There's a scene in that movie where Connery is beaten senseless by two small, slim female gymnasts. And on the commentary, Guy Hamilton, who's this old Englishman, is like, so in the script, Sean comes to this house and there's some big fellow and they get into a punch-up and, well, we've seen it, haven't we? And I was watching the Olympics with my wife and there were these gymnasts and I went, these women are terrifying. Wouldn't it be wonderful to see these, 90-pound women kick big 6'4" Sean all over the place? Wouldn't that be just a delightful scene? And there's another great scene in that movie where Connery gets into a fist fight with a guy in a very small elevator to the point where he's sucker punching the guy, but he gets alerted. The guy he's going to punch gets alerted because when he draws his arm back to punch, his elbow goes through the window because the room is just that small. And that, he said, that came from the set. The brilliant production designer Ken Adam lived in some tiny apartment in London with one of those creaky, ancient, turn of the century London elevators that moved a mile an hour, and you could maybe fit two people in it. And he and the producers were on their way to visit Ken Adam, and he said, wouldn't it be amazing to get Sean and some other guy that's 6'5" in this 3x3 room, completely unable to land a punch on each other because there just literally isn't the room. And to me, that is the job, is approach every moment and go, how has this never been done before? What can I do? And like I said, do you win that fight every time? No. Sometimes the hero is running up to the enemy's base and they shoot the guard on the run, and that's it. You don't need to make it a bigger moment than that. Not every time. Not every time as the guard falls does he have to say, I never saw Venice. But if you can put an I never saw Venice in every once in a while, I think that's you can tell me if I've accurately described what it is that you're referring to.
No, that's exactly it. And I now have your secret formula on tape, so it all works out.
I mean, it's funny to think of keep everything entertaining and keep the story moving is some kind of secret. That seems to me to be like literally the most basic job of anyone in the popular arts is keep the story moving and keep things exciting and keep them interesting and keep them funny.
Do you ever have the urge to, like, when you're writing, to just sort of have a character just sort of explain what went on rather than, just sort of going through that? How do you avoid that trap?
Exposition is a really tricky thing. It's the thing that almost everyone struggles with, is how do you get information across in an entertaining way? I read an article about screenwriting when I was a teenager where the guy used The Empire Strikes Back as a really good there are a lot of ways you could get across the information that, spoiler alert, Darth Vader is Luke Skywalker's father. He gets it across during a spectacular action sequence. Whereas in Star Wars, Luke and Obi-Wan sit down and they have a talk, and it's well written, and you have Alec Guinness, who can make George Lucas's sometimes not very well written dialogue sound like Shakespeare. And that's not something you have in comic books. You don't have, I've got an actor who's going to sell this. So for me, partially it's you embed the information the audience needs in action. You make it funny. There's a running gag in the Elvira comics, and there I have the lucky thing that Elvira breaks the fourth wall all the time. So, I had a thing in the first 2 issues where she would give recaps in the comic and then turn to the audience and say, I'm not doing this again. I don't do exposition. But I also, and I think this is an even bigger thing, I think exposition is overrated. I have somewhere like 10 Commandments of Writing Movies by Billy Wilder. And one of the things he says, which I've never forgotten, is let the audience add 2 + 2 and they will love you forever. If they feel like they're ahead of you, if they feel like they've figured out something before you told it to them clearly, they love that you made them feel smart. They love that you let them solve that puzzle for them. And as an audience member, I completely agree with that. A lot of times when I will say this, I've written exposition a lot where I've gone, when I go back and edit, I'm like, they don't actually need to know that. That's not actually, I think Joel Silver used to call it POI, plausible off-screen information. The far opposite of that, I ghost wrote a couple of action movies in the early 90s, and I had a scene where characters were getting on a plane in Arizona, and the next time we saw them, they were going to get off a plane in Molokai, Hawaii. And the producer, I kid you not, said, well, there's no direct flight from Phoenix Sky Harbor to Molokai, so we need to write a line where the guy selling them the ticket says, you'll connect through Los Angeles and Honolulu. And I said, you're going to have to write that line because I cannot bring myself to do something that fucking stupid. I'm sorry. The audience wow. does not need to know that the secret agent characters fleeing the supervillain changed planes twice. Like I said, as long as we show a different plane landing in Hawaii than the one they took off in, I am willing to let the audience figure out that there are no direct flights between Phoenix Sky Harbor and Molokai Airport. Molokai Airport being a postage stamp with an airfield on it. I was just like,
but who's going to sit down and figure that out, though?
Well, but that's the thing. In the throes of an action movie, they absolutely do not care. They know that characters got on a plane and land. Like you don't even need the shot of the plane landing. Show them driving down you could cut to them driving down the beach in Molokai. They got to Molokai, and unless there's something plot related, I will admit that I hate this. Now, if in that same movie, we had previously set up that the 2 women going to Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport had no money, no passports, then I'm really fucking curious about how the hell they got to Molokai. And I cannot tell you how many movies do that. Do Bruce Wayne crawls out of a hole in Afghanistan and somehow, with no shoes, and somehow gets back to Gotham City. And I'm like, I want to know how that fucker even afforded a phone call to Alfred to get a passport FedEx to him, like that he arrived 5 hours later from Afghanistan, which also doesn't seem possible. I have an expression which is don't make the audience ask questions you can't answer. You know, when you imply something and you go, wait, what? How did? And there are so many things where it's easy to answer that question. You know what I mean? Like Bruce Wayne getting out of the hole in Afghanistan. Does he jump a officer that has a passport on him that he can fake? Like sometimes there are super easy answers that they don't bother giving you. So then you're sitting there going, wait, how did they get from there to, okay. I guess I'm not supposed to wonder about how shoeless Bruce Wayne, whose back was broken last time I checked, somehow showed up in a bat suit and the bat plane in Gotham City less than 24 hours later after something that's at least an 18-hour flight. Like, I don't know how any of that happened. And there are ways you can get around stuff. There's magic, there's whatever, but as I said, if the audience is going to have a minute of like, how the hell did they do that? Then don't do it. You know, like I said, there are a million ways. I've seen so many movies where there's a moment that stops the audience in their tracks and they can't figure out what's going on. And you literally could have thrown in one line of dialogue, and that dialogue didn't have to be, oh, he changed planes in Honolulu. I'm not talking about things like that. I'm talking about giant leaps of logic where you go, but he didn't have shoes. Like, is it so hard to show him, mugging a business traveler in Dubai airport or something just so that I can go, oh, okay, sure.
And we'll be back with more David Avellone after these brief commercial messages. Love you, babies. Well, David, it looks like we're up against the end of our show.
Yes.
That leaves us to our last segment, the fun part.
I am ready. Hit me.
Awesome. So, which Ninja Turtle would you see yourself as?
My heart says Mikey and my head says Leonardo. And the truth is Leonardo.
Nice.
I don't have to be in charge, but I've noticed when there are leadership vacuums, I step into them. So given that you've got Donatello and Rafe and Mikey standing around being jackasses, I think I'd have to Leonardo it up.
What song would you walk down the runway to?
I walked down the aisle at my wedding to the James Bond theme. Nice. So, and I can even specifically say the gun barrel from the opening of Live and Let Die, which has a slight Isaac Hayes funk to it that is only in that movie. But yes, that is actually what I walked down the aisle to. So that would be what I walk down the runway to.
So are you the kind of person who would adopt a chicken and give it a full name?
I'm not the kind of person who would adopt a chicken. So there's that. My cats can have very complicated names, but I don't want a pet that I'm going to someday maybe throw on the barbecue.
No, I'm with you right there. What inspires you?
Ooh, that's there are too many answers to that question. Other art inspires me, music inspires me, love inspires me, which encompasses my friends, my wife, my father and mother. Those are the biggest inspirations to me. But the way in which the art I've consumed over my life has inspired me, it's undeniable.
Is there a particular set of criteria that you look for in a sidekick or henchman?
I'm going to sound like a supervillain if I say loyalty, but loyalty is an underrated. But I would say that I don't know that I'm looking for henchmen so much. I like partners. And the thing that's most important in a partner is they bring the thing that you don't have to the table. And the best example I can give, because it's such a model for, it's a model and an inspiration for me, as goofy as it's going to sound. But the Captain Kirk model of friendship, which is Spock is his best friend for a lot of reasons. One of them is Spock always has a perspective he wants to listen to. That's valuable. And so does McCoy. And they both have valuable perspectives. And the way to be a leader and a friend and a collaborator is to have collaborators, henchmen, crewmen, let's say, instead of henchmen. Let's say bridge crew.
There you go.
I'm not looking for henchmen. I'm looking for bridge crew. And what I want them to be, like in making comic books, I can't draw worth a damn. Dave Acosta will have things, not just the fact that he can draw, but because he's an artist, he understands things about the process I am incapable of understanding. And so his input is invaluable. When I've been a film director, it's what I look for in a director of photography or in a composer or in an actor. Is the greatest moment when you're directing something you've written is when an actor does something you didn't see, you didn't tell them to do. And you go, oh man, I never thought of that line that way, but that is actually the best way to think of that line. Nice. These are not lightning round answers. They're lightning round questions, but I'm giving very, very complicated answers.
Well, David, we've done 3 interviews now, so I figure, this is about what I expect. Yeah. So it's all good. Where do you find joy?
Where do I find joy? Primarily in my wife. She is an endless joy to me. And I think that's who you want as a partner in your life. And I find a lot of joy in my cats. I think that the secret to happiness, not to give away the meaning of life on your podcast, but the secret to happiness is to never grow tired of the things that give you joy and to never forget that joy and to never let go of that joy, to look at a blue sky and feel joy. I will tell as brief as I can make this anecdote, because it's a very long story. I got stabbed once.
Go for it.
The being stabbed part isn't the important part of the story. The part of the story is that at the time I drank a lot of Coca-Cola. I enjoy Coca-Cola. I like the way it tastes. The entire process where I was stabbed and I went to the hospital and I was patched up and I went home, I never got that upset. I didn't cry. I didn't get overly agitated. I was like, well, I got to keep my clear head and see my way through this crisis, and it's all going to work out. And it all did work out. The next morning, I looked in my refrigerator and I was out of Coca-Cola. I walked to the supermarket and I picked up a 2-liter bottle of Coca-Cola and I burst into tears. And I thought, I have lived to taste Coca-Cola again. And I have never forgotten the lesson of that moment, that something you love, you should never go like, it's just Coca-Cola. It's the same every day. I don't give a shit. No, it's fucking great. And if you love it, love it. Love it with your full heart. Love it every single time. Value the things that you love. Value the things that bring you joy. Try your damnedest to never get bored of them. And one of the things that brings me the greatest joy now, and I always post to Instagram a picture of my comps when I've written a comic and it's coming out in stores and I get a package in the mail and I open it and it's the new issue that I wrote that's going to be on stands in a couple of days. And every time I post that picture, I write, it never gets old, part, 79. Because it never, ever, ever gets old. And the minute I open a box of comps and go, it's the issue, fuck that. Then I should retire and do something else for a living. So So a lot of things bring me joy, and I try to never let go of that joy.
That is one of the best answers we've ever had.
Well, thank you.
To that one.
It is heartfelt.
That is fantastic, David.
Thank you.
All right, so you live in any version of the Marvel Universe, and you happen to be an Avenger. One day, Thanos comes down with the Infinity Gauntlet, and he is going to snap his fingers and wipe half of all reality out of existence. But just before he can do that, he falls dead and dies of a heart attack as you're fighting him, which puts you, of course, in the position where you are in immediate possession of the Infinity Gauntlet. You now have the ability to bend reality to your will. What's the first thing you do with it?
Give it to Steve Rogers. I'm sorry, he's a better man than I am. I'm not. I'm unqualified to make that decision. I would give it to the nicest guy I know, because I'm just gonna end up beaming Trump into a volcano, and that's not a great use of the Infinity Gauntlet.
I think that's a perfectly valid use of it.
Let someone who's not petty and vindictive have the glove, and because I know maybe that's a cop out answer, but I know Steve will do the right thing. That is my cop out answer. I mean, yeah, I could sit down and I could sit down and solve world hunger. Let Steve. Let Steve do that. He's a better man. He won't be, because the thing is, the power of the glove is such that if there is while I'm solving world hunger, I'm also going to end up throwing Mitch McConnell off a cliff, and that's I don't think the glove is for that. So Steve wouldn't do that. Steve's a good guy. Let Steve take care of it.
So what's next for the talented David Avellone?
What's next? Thank you, as always, for your kind words. What's next is at least 5 issues of Elvira Meets Vincent Price. Believe it or not, there are 2 further Elvira one-shot special issues, which may be done through Kickstarter. There's a dream project that I pitched to a comic book company last week, and they liked it and asked me to give them more information. That I don't want to, spoiler, but it's actually about it's somewhat about me and my dad, but it's also the elevator pitch version, which I always love elevator pitch versions, which make people go cross-eyed. So the pitch for this one is, it's The Princess Bride meets Saving Private Ryan.
Nice.
So I'm working on bringing that off. And
oh, I know what it is.
You do know it. You probably saw it in the anthology or heard about it. But yeah, so that's that. There's been some interest in that now at a comic book company that I like and would like to work with. And the artist that I had lined up for it is interested in coming back, so that's great. And beyond that, there's the 3rd volume of Drawing Blood, which Kevin and Ben are still finishing up the 2nd volume. My work has been done on that for a few months, but they have some pages to draw before we can get that out. And then volume 1 and volume 2 of that will both be trade paperbacks in bookstores and on Comixology and all that. And then the 3rd volume of that, I have some ideas ready to go on that. And then Kevin and I are also working on a completely new project, which is a post-apocalyptic thing that is also too early to talk about. But that's mostly what I got going.
Well, David, I wanted to thank you for taking the time to join us on my humble little show.
Oh, my pleasure, and thank you for inviting me.
So where can people find you online?
The easiest thing is my website, davidavallonefreelance.com. That branches off to everywhere, including my Twitter and my YouTube and all that. I do 2 podcasts, one called Pulp Today, where I read old pulp fiction, and one called The Writer's Block, where I talk comics and the creation of comics and the comics industry with my co-host Rylan Grant and a variety of great guests every week. And all of that. If you go to my Twitter, there's a thing called Linktree, and the Linktree has all of the jumping off points to all of that stuff.
And now it's time to close the show. Imagine it. The lights beginning to come on in an empty theater. People starting to get up from their seats. The smell of popcorn crushed on the floor. And the thought runs through your head that Titular Characters is awesome, and you want to support it. Fear not, my friends. There are tons of ways to do it. You can follow Eva at EvaIsAdorable on Twitter. You can leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Podchaser, Castbox, or Podcast Addict. And if you're feeling super generous, you can leave some dough at buymeacoffee.com/EvaIsAdorable. There, you can contribute as little as $1. And every bit goes towards paying for production and hosting of this show. How cool is that? Titular Characters is a show about the things we love. It is produced and hosted by the adorable Eva Webb. Opening theme by Antonia Marquis. Closing theme by Mikey Flash of Speed Force Music. The dreamy announcer guy who reads the credits is Donnie Underwood. That's me. Join us next time for another death-defying adventure in cyberspace. See you then!